Now, the members of the Conservative Party are pretty upset with Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak seen as the man who was there to bring fiscal stability to the Conservative governance after the horrors of Liz Truss's mini-budget and what that did to markets and the Conservative Party's fiscal credibility. Rishi Sunak's project was trying to rebuild that credibility. But of course, there are still plenty of truthers who believe, in fact, that Rishi Sunak is not indeed the god of fiscal credibility, and again, he is flushing their potential election victory down the drain, and that their real route to victory was through sticking with Liz Truss's economic reforms. There's a large number of people who believe that Liz Truss was forced out by some kind of left-wing blob, this left-wing economic consensus that definitely doesn't exist, and that she was forced out completely against her will and with no genuine reason. One of the people who is potentially discussing this is Fraser Nelson, who's written this article here in The Spectator, which is called "Was Liz Truss Wrong or Wronged?" Now, I've already read this through, to be fair, and he says some things here which I think are worth critiquing. And I want to set some economic truths, because we've discussed Liz Truss so much, yet we've not really properly taken to task her defenders. We've made loads of comparisons with Rachel Reeves and why those are poor comparisons, but I think it's well worth actually scrutinising the claims of her defenders and why these things just really don't add up. A year ago, Liz Truss and Kwarteng had just announced that they would be holding a mini-budget. It turned out to be the tax-cutting budget that people like me had long been arguing for. Now, that's where a lot of the issues lie within the Conservative Party, is they believe that Rishi Sunak is too high tax. They believe that he's too high tax, and the Conservative Party have lost their mojo at being the party of low taxes. Unfortunately, Rishi Sunak has realised that to win the election, they need to have properly funded public services that they've not done, because he cut them all. So they're really in a rock and a hard place between trying to win over their core base by cutting taxes and wanting to not have an economy in free fall by raising taxes to be able to pay at least normal public services for political gain. There's this real kind of push-pull between doing what the electorate wants and what the Conservative Party membership want. That's where Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak lie either side of this divide. So why wasn't I more supportive at the time and since? I look at this in my Daily Telegraph column, and it takes us to debate we have quite often had on the Spectator's offices, where Truss has got it right and where she got it wrong. During the Tory leadership campaign, my sympathies were more with Truss and her tax-cutting growth message. James Forsyth was leaning a bit more towards Sunak and Kate Andrews and asking why Truss's numbers didn't add up. But of course, James Forsyth was going to side with Rishi Sunak. He was best man at his wedding. When Kate Andrews is not in the tax-cutting camp, you know that Liz Truss is on some thin ice, when even Kate Andrews, the one who wants to privatise the NHS, is not on their side. Kate and I debated the Truss legacy on a podcast, and we've been rekindling that debate in the office in recent days. Here's how I saw it. Truss was using the language of tax cuts, but the cuts she proposed were quite mild, nowhere enough to kickstart the 2.5% growth that she spoke about. I agreed with her that, in theory, some tax cuts would pay for themselves by generating more growth. I agreed with her that the markets would probably lend for this purpose. Kwasi Kwarteng, as Chancellor, pointed out that if the market would lend £400 billion to close down the economy in COVID, then it would lend for economic rejuvenation. Now, I don't actually see where on earth that logic would come from. I mean, if anything, we've seen that low taxation never necessarily leads to higher growth or even higher investment. We have a lack of investment that's really contributing to low growth in this country. And the idea that giving a bunch of wealthy people who already invested highly in assets rather than in productive businesses would want to further invest rather than pump liquidity into existing assets, or take that money and then put it in the Cayman Islands, I don't see the logic behind what he's saying. That would necessitate additional growth if you engage in those tax cuts, rather than engaging in the growth that is, in my view, stymied by such poor public services and poor public provision, where our country is basically falling apart structurally, and that's really damaging our economic growth prospects. And also, the idea that the markets would lend for tax cuts, I think has some credence. In general, I think that the UK bond market is notoriously stable and has been for a very, very long time, and the idea that for modest tax cuts there would be no real market repercussion as long as there was, I don't know, proper forecasting, that's foreshadowing for later, proper forecasting on what these additional bond issuances would be used for, I think would leave the markets reasonably calm in response. And I think trying to compare that to the amount of money that was generated both through quantitative easing and also through bond issuance to be able to close down the economy for furlough, I think it's different to try and say that when it's to do with something as an emergency as the coronavirus pandemic was, than it is for some plan to use tax cuts for growth with no actual report from the Office of Budget Responsibility. So in theory, Truss and Kwarteng were correct. In practice, the following points sank them. The Truss team never explained how much growth they expected in return for their tax cuts. This made it look as even if they had no plan, just verbiage. That's true. The Truss tax cuts, when they eventually came, would have added up to about £25 billion on a £1 trillion government receipts. So even if she had stayed, the UK would still have been struggling under the highest tax burden for 70 odd years. The Truss wrongly complained about, even as far as European countries go, is not indeed a particularly high in real terms tax burden when you look at, for example, say G20 countries. For too long, we've actually been too much of a low-tax country, in my opinion. And I don't think you can cut your way necessarily to growth, given the circumstances of the economy as it is. At The Spectator, we calculated that her mini-budget meant taxes would actually keep rising, albeit not by as much. Not necessarily going to disagree with that. The market mood had turned. By September 2022, it was obvious that Kate Andrews' much-derided warnings about inflation were right, and rates had started to rise just as she foresaw. The era of cheap money was over. Now, the idea that increases in the interest rate because of inflation, which would then, I agree, would have a knock-on effect on government bond yields, that is true. But just because bond yields are rising because of inflationary pressures does not necessarily mean that we would get the massive increase in bond yields because of any fiscal expansion coming from the government. I don't think you can draw that comparison. These are two separate things. Bond yields that increase sharply due to government recklessness are not related to what the current rate of inflation is specifically. There's no direct correlation between those two things. They may increase a lot if you do a huge amount of borrowing with no possible spending plan, no plan for growth, no plan to recruit that money at a time of high inflation that could lead to hyperinflation. That's something that you could be scared of, but that's not what was being proposed either by Liz Truss or by anybody else. Then there were hidden pensions crisis, a staggering £500 billion in peculiar investment vehicles sensitive to large interest rate rises now underway. Or this was actually yield rises is what they were sensitive to. But no one saw it coming. Incompetent regulation led to a repeat in Britain of the subprime mortgage crisis. Weird how these right-wing libertarian economic types seem to think we should have more regulation. Again, failure of prudential regulation continually in this country over and over and over again. Truss would have delayed the budget if she'd been warned that this LDI crisis was blowing up and the Bank of England needed to deal with it before any fuel was added to this fire. It's all well and good saying that Truss would have dealt with it if she'd have known. It's Kwasi Kwarteng's job to know. Kwasi Kwarteng was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. It was his job to know exactly what was going to happen if bond yields were to increase. It's literally in his job description to be in contact with things like pension funds, to understand what their leverages are and how many liabilities they have, so to make sure there isn't a run on them in the case of a liquidity crisis. Like, it's his literal job to know the state of these funds, and he just did it regardless, with no foresight, no OBR report, no nothing, just tax cuts for no reason with no forecasting whatsoever. So the idea that this wasn't Truss's fault is completely nonsensical when it's both hers and Kwarteng's job to understand the impact of sharp bond yield rises on potential pension fund collapse. Do you think the Tories and Truss are just out of ideas and they gambled because of their Thatcherism doesn't work? I mean, that is also a pretty good summation as well. Regulators and financial commentators had all missed the massive bomb under the UK economy, so it suited everybody, Sunak, Starmer and analysts and financial pundits, to blame it all on Truss. Well, yes, because she didn't know, and there was no forecast. The pension funds crisis was directly related to the increase in bond yields, which was caused because the markets lost faith in the government, but more on that later. But the centrepiece of our economic plan was a massive, open-ended commitment to subsidise fuel bills. How much would it have cost? She had asked the OBR not to score her mini-budget, so there was no real answer. That's a little piece of pertinent information that's just been kind of smuggled through completely surreptitiously in this article of Fraser. I wonder if that might be super important to the facts of this case here. The only figures published were those from the Treasury figures looking at just 6 months of the scheme. At £60 billion, they said, scarier than earlier IFS estimates of £60 billion for 1 year, £100 billion for 2 years. Cornwall Insight had the same range. By comparison, Sunak's furlough will cost £69 billion, so it looks like Truss was to top that quite easily and embark upon the biggest borrow and spend attempted by any government, Labour or Tory. Almost like she should have done a windfall tax, but you know. Her tax cuts were dwarf in comparison to her splurge. 1 part Reagan to 4 parts Chavez. Chavez is where you use government fiscal expansion to subsidise energy prices. She's literally 80% 21st century socialism. 80% of her is Chavez, according to Fraser Nelson, which is an incredible claim for him to make. Oh, it's exactly the same like Jonathan Rentoul saying that Liz Truss and Corbyn are one of the same. Truss argued there was no time to come up with anything cheaper or more open-ended than her bailout. In her defence, her energy package ended up costing far less because energy prices fell faster than expected. Truss was right to say her splurge ended up costing almost half as much as the IFS feared. But absolutely no one predicted that at the time, her own Treasury very much included. Futures markets had a very clear and quite terrifying view on upcoming fuel costs, so that after the shock on all of her mini-budget, it would have seemed the markets, like Truss, was embarking on Britain's biggest ever borrow and spend package without offering any visibility on how much it was likely to cost. This spooked them. This is a complete and utter lie. This is nonsense. This is abject nonsense from Fraser Nelson, trying to twist the idea that an energy package that was actually announced before the mini budget, like the mini budget was the one that precipitated the increase in bond yields, that spike over that weekend. The idea of the energy price guarantee had already been floated and was understood to be government policy days before, and the markets didn't react. They only reacted after the complete recklessness of the lack of OBR oversight over the fiscal event that they did on that ill-fated weekend. The idea that it was to do with the energy market, the energy price guarantee that caused the markets to get spooked is complete revisionism, it's complete nonsense, right? What the markets want is stability. They want stability, they want to understand that they have a safe investment. And they know they don't have a safe investment if nobody in the country can afford their fuel bills. If the government had done nothing and people couldn't spend any money at all because all of their money was going on fuel, that would have collapsed the economy overnight. And that would have the markets would have looked at it and gone, they have no plan to deal with this upcoming gigantic country-destroying fuel crisis. If they have no plan, that would have spooked the markets. In fact, the fact they had a plan for it all along, where they had, this is our plan of what we're going to spend it on, this is the ends that we want to achieve to stop people, not being able to heat their homes or not being able to consume anything at all because they're spending literally every penny on fuel bills. That is the stability that the markets would actually have been looking for. This is complete and abject nonsense. The real reasons why we saw a massive jump in bond yields over the mini budget is because there was no forecast. The government just went, we're going to cut 5,000 taxes with zero oversight. We're not going to show how much we're going to gain in taxes from the proposed Laffer curve increases. We're not going to show how we're potentially going to recoup any lost investment that we're going to have to pay for through additional fiscal expansion. And the markets realise we have a complete nutter in charge of the economy. That's what spooked the markets. That's what spooked them. If you have a costed, proportionate spending plan, good reasons for what you're going to spend it on, and proper forecasts on how that's going to help the country, markets don't care. There's a great article from Simon Wren-Lewis, who's a macroeconomist, who I highly, highly recommend people to actually look at. What the market reaction to unfunded tax cuts does tell you is that your macroeconomic policy should be transparent, credible, and sustainable. That is something that Labour chancellors and shadow chancellors normally understand. This is exactly what they want. Sustainability, credibility, and transparency. None of which you got from Liz Truss. She was being transparent and credible when she was saying we have this plan to be able to save people on their energy bills so the entire economy doesn't fucking collapse. The markets were fine with that. But when she said, lol, tax cuts, let's go, suddenly they realised they were dealing with idiots. To summarise, just as people should have been pleased when the markets forced the government to abandon the exchange rate peg in '92, we should also be pleased that the markets have inflicted pain on a government that thought unfunded tax cuts made sense when public services are in dire trouble. The entire Conservative Party's obsession with tax cuts, in an environment when many factors mean that the demand for health services will rise as a share of GDP over time, has been and always will be damaging to the UK economy. Unfortunately, we require much more than recent events for the Conservative Party to understand their error. This is exactly what I'm talking about. And Fraser Nelson is talking absolute he's talking complete nonsense by trying to say that it wasn't the tax cut, it's the energy price guarantee. He smuggled in the lack of an OBR forecast in the middle of the weeds there so we'd ignore it, but I spotted what he was doing there. I knew what you're doing, Mr. Nelson. Trying to blame extra public expenditure on sensible things like ensuring that the economy doesn't collapse. Trying to blame that and not just blaming unfunded, unforecasted tax cuts. Absolute, complete nonsense. What Truss and Kwarteng were shooting for was the JFK argument, that a deficit caused by stagnation was worse than a deficit used to fund tax cuts and fund a transition to higher growth. While we're here, let's quickly quote Kennedy's speech to the New York Economic Society. Truly, the lesson of the last decade is that budget deficits are not caused by wild-eyed spenders, but by slow economic growth and by periodic recessions. Then any new recession would break all deficit records. In paradoxical.
Neoliberalism.
Hey, thank you for the gifted sub, much appreciated. Neoliberalism indeed. Excellent work. The perfect time for that alert to come through. In short, it is a paradoxical truth that tax rates are too high today and tax revenues are too low, and the soundest way to raise revenues in the long run is to cut the rates now. Now, the second part is complete nonsense, and we've seen that as a result of all of this. But this is true. The budget deficits are not caused by wild-eyed spenders, but by slow economic growth, which is true. Which is why spending to get the growth to be able to cover the spending, like we did in the entirety of the Keynesian post-war economic consensus, post-1945, literally bears that out. We kept deficit spending, and our debt to GDP ratio continued to decrease from 1945 onwards to the oil crisis of 73. I agree with the theory, but I don't think that Sunak and Kwarteng tax cuts would have been enough. The only space for serious tax cuts would have been created was to seriously reform government spending. But Truss splurged in a crisis. This is how big government gets bigger, crisis by crisis. Truss could have stemmed this by excluding the rich from the fuel bill subsidies, in fact, means testing them, which obviously we all know is nonsense, far more than she did. Or she could have windfall taxed the energy companies, which she didn't. So her proposed extra extra spend vastly outweighed her proposed tax cuts. Again, revisionism here. The Tories, I fear, are learning the wrong lessons from Truss by putting her down as a kamikaze tax cutter. She'd have liked to go down as a free market martyr, but she ended up running short of a leg of relay race of high spending, big state conservatives. Her borrow and spend sank her, not her slash and cut tax agenda. Bollocks. Nonsense. That is complete nonsense from an absolute clown, Fraser Nelson. Here's a question: has any mainstream journalist actually tackled why growth is good in the first place, is treated like the fucking tides? Why are people on the left using a capitalist metric to measure health and well-being of society? I mean, yes, that is stupid, and if anything, the coronavirus pandemic has taught us that there are plenty of other metrics that are worth using that aren't indeed GDP, which is a pretty nonsense metric to use entirely as a metric of the well-being of society. But I think growth is good if you want to increase your tax receipts, to be able to ensure that you can still have expansionary policy, to be able to make sure that you get positive outcomes from state expenditure regardless. But it's a means to an end. It's not the end in of itself. Don't like Fraser. He seems like a grifter. He's not a grifter. He's just a moron. Just a right-wing neoliberal ideologue. If you enjoyed this video, please do consider liking and subscribing. It does help out the channel and the algorithm. And if you click the bell notification icon, it will let you know when I go live and when I upload videos. If you'd like to follow me on social media, my handle is @NoJusticeMTG, and that is Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitch, and YouTube. If you want to support my channel in a more financial manner, you can do so by becoming a member for just 99p, by super chatting, or by supporting me on Patreon, with the link is in the description of this video. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next segment.